is something good. All right, friends. Thanks for being with us, and thanks again for tolerating the first few minutes of our time together. Chapter 29 today. Some thematic stuff. A lot. Again, we have a lot of ruler stuff.
Right.
Some justice stuff. A little bit, maybe not as quite as cohesive as yesterday, but there are some things that get repeated throughout this chapter. I didn't get very far. I got to verse 1 before it caught my attention.
Same.
One who is often reproved yet remains stubborn will suddenly be broken beyond healing. Having lived this out in my life many, many, many times, I smile at the truth of it. When you remain stubborn, the only way to be broken is sudden. You don't grow into awareness when you're pig-headed, when you're set in your ways, when you're convinced you're right. The only downfall is swift and tragic at that point. I mean, you don't just kind of quietly wake up to the fact you're wrong in those moments. It comes crashing down on you, and I have personal experience with that on multiple occasions.
You know, Clint, there are some people that you might say are stubborn people, that it's a primary part of their character. There is, though, I think, in every human, stubbornness. I mean, you will find stubbornness in every person. Even the most compliant people that you might think of will have a moment of stubbornness. And I do think that there's sort of this universal principle that it is good to be in a position where you do have reproof. I think that there is a temptation, and this is especially true for those whose stubbornness is closer to that primary place in their life, that they sort of eject people from their life who get in the way. And there's wisdom, especially if you tend to sort of, buckle down and go twice as hard when somebody says something. It's good to keep people in your life who will be honest with you, who will continue to offer reproof, because really that's the only way through to healing, even if it's sometimes a very challenging path to get there.
So for better or worse, I've actually done a lot of thinking about stubbornness in my life, and stubbornness in some ways reflects the book of Proverbs in the idea of seeking wisdom, because stubbornness is a good thing. To be stubborn is a positive,
right,
until this very moment and this razor-thin line in which it isn't.
Right.
It's good to be independent. It's good to be able to tolerate pain. It's good to say, I don't need to go to the doctor for a sprained ankle and this. But then the problem with stubbornness is there is this moment where it goes from a good thing to a bad thing, and there's really no in between. It is a positive, and then at some point when it goes too far, it's a negative, and it becomes costly. And in some ways, that's the paradigm of the book of Proverbs, is that moment of transition and recognizing it and staying on the right side of the line. That's the tricky thing that we call wisdom.
You use the word instant or sudden. You also have to really recognize it's subtle. It's not always a huge chasm that you just jump over in a moment. I think that's part of the thing that makes stubbornness so hard is it feels the same on the other side of the line as it did on the good side. And, I know lots of people share this story. There's no criticism meant in it, but there are many people who've experienced that parent who's gotten to a point where the stubbornness to push forward has been good their entire life until it's time for them to stop driving and then try to talk sense in that situation. And it's not that person's behaving differently. Right. It's that the outcome is no longer helpful, and it's a subtle shift that I think takes significant self-awareness. And, by the way, I think it takes the willingness to be reproved.
Yeah. And again, this is ground. I don't know much about lots of aspects of wisdom, but stubbornness I can talk about fairly confidently. The other struggle in that is that you essentially have built a pattern. Somebody tells you can't do something, you do it. this thing is going to take, just focus, determination, you do it. And then at some point, you need to simply turn that off.
Right.
Like, well, in this instance, being stubborn isn't helpful. Stop doing it. Well, if that's what you know,
right,
it's not easy to do that. And we've all had some real experiences with the kind of stubbornness that is destructive, where people stop talking to each other and they just walk away from one another, or they won't admit they're wrong, or stubbornness can be a very dangerous thing, because there is that moment where stubbornness and pride are so linked together that they can't give. And stubborn is wonderful as long as, I think, like you said, Michael, it is willing to be questioned. It is willing to be evaluated. And the moment at which it isn't, then I think it becomes dangerous for us. And I'm sorry, I could easily spend the whole time together on stubbornness, because it's something I've tried to understand in myself and others. But that's a good proverb.
I'm all the way down to verse 6 next.
Okay, I had 5.
All right.
Whoever flatters a neighbor is spreading a net for the neighbor's feet. Again, the idea of we've seen this before, a good witness, a truth teller.
Yep.
So to flatter the neighbor is ultimately not to do them any favors. And this is that, on the flippant side, this is that thing we live in. It happened to me just the other day. I had an outfit on, and I asked Jane, "Hey, this look okay?" And I got the little pause.
Uh-huh.
And we've been married long enough. I know the little pause is not she's thinking about it. She's thinking how to say, "No, that doesn't look good," without me being upset with her. So it's like, I'll take that as a no. She could have said, "Oh, you looked great," and sent me out of the house looking like I had dressed myself either colorblind or in the dark. But fortunately, she didn't. But flattery, the danger of flattery is that it's not true. And in the book of Proverbs, that matters. It matters in life.
We go down to verse 6 then. In the transgression of the evil, there is a snare, but the righteous sing and rejoice. I think Proverbs shares a very consistent message throughout that we need to be reminded of over and over and over, and that is the low-hanging fruit, the temptations of sin, the allure of pride and acquisition, of the things that we are tempted to do because they feel good in the moment and because we believe the promise that they're going to make life perfect or better or whatever it is. These are the things that will be a snare. These will ultimately be bad for us. They'll be bad for our soul. But Proverbs goes farther than that. It'll be bad for your relationships. It'll be bad for your pocketbook. That there's a cost of doing evil. And yet the righteous will sing and rejoice. It's not a new theme. We've seen it before. But I just think this is a beautiful way of saying it. There are just those people who you can look at their countenance and you can see they're humming on their way to the next task, that they have a kind of joy and lightness. Righteousness brings with it a spirit of joy and lightness and song. And the evils that are often so tempting to us, these will ultimately snare us and wreak havoc on our souls, and we should avoid them.
Good. Yeah, I had the next one. The righteous know the rights of the poor. The wicked have no such understanding. Not a lot to say about this one other than, again, the Proverbs does us a service by pointing out that to be godly is to think of those beneath us. And part of the problem of wickedness or sinfulness is that it's always looking to self and how to move up. And it is really not very conscious of those beneath because they can't be used, they can't help. So they can be exploited, as we've seen in the book of Proverbs and other places. But the righteous consider those who are at risk or in need. And that's something we should always be aware of.
I actually had verse 8, so we're just going in order here. Scoffers set a city aflame, but the wise turn away wrath. I could probably spend most of a study on this one. The short version of this is, I, for a long time, felt like we lose something as people, individually, but also culturally and as a community when we allow our language to become scoffing, when we allow it to become sarcastic, when we allow it to begin to cut down others in many different senses. And, Clint, as someone who for a long time has appreciated sarcastic humor, I think we sometimes, and that's not all what's wrapped up in scoffing, but if you let me dial in on that, there's a sense when you allow what you say to continually to be a blade that cuts against others, it will ultimately set the city to flame. I think that's the right image. It spreads when you use your words in such a way that minimizes the fears and concerns of others. When we use our behavior and our interactions with others in such a way that we minimize the things that matter, this stuff is dangerous and it has long-term implications. And part of that, really practically, is some of my real struggle with late night talk show hosts and comedians that make lots of the rounds, because lots of the things that get said don't seem like they move the conversation forward. They seem like they're cutting and they actually pull people backwards.
Yeah, Proverbs has given us lots of opportunities to think about not only what we say, but how we say it, and to scoff, to slander, to ridicule, to criticize. This is a big category that is held together by the theme of negative speech. And yeah, those things are sparks. They breed conflict, they breed bad feelings, they bring on controversy, and it's just not good.
I'm jumping down to verse 18.
Yeah, well, let me jump in here at 11 then. A fool gives full vent to anger, but the wise quietly hold it back. And again, context matters in Proverbs. There are times not to hold back anger, but generally speaking, when fools vent, the wise do not. And there's I get to watch this one play out fairly regularly in the ranks of coaching, and the people who watching a game just have this instant angry reaction to whatever doesn't go right for them. And Proverbs might categorize that as foolish, and rightly so. But this idea that to let our anger lead us, or to let our temper out of control, is not likely taking us in the path of wisdom. Yeah, I can again attest to that one. That's the truth of that one.
Where there is no prophecy, the people cast off restraint, but happy are those who keep the law. I think this is a communally focused way of saying, we were talking about this before we came on, that if there's not a place of truth, if there's not a place of God's voice breaking into our lives, then we're going to tend to live our lives loosely and without boundaries, without some anchoring. And that's not going to be good for either public happiness, or it's not even going to be good for the general sort of structure of society. And that's a very reformed way of reading this proverb. The reformers and people in the reformed faith have forever said that there is not just good, intrinsic good in the law that God has given us for the people who follow it, but it's good for society. It's good for our civic discourse, that there's some merit that happens in our public world when the people of God live their faith authentically. And I think that's reflected here.
Michael, I had the verse just prior to that. You may be a little young to appreciate this verse yet. Discipline your children, and they will give you rest, and they will delight your heart. I suspect you're not at a part of parenting where you anticipate much rest.
This is a promise that delight is coming. Yes!
At any point in the near future, you're still in the thick of that. But there is this, and the other part of this, as we all know, parenting is never done. There's not a moment where you're not worried about your kids and you're not trying to help with this thing and that thing. But there is, I think, that moment that if we're fortunate, where we look at our children and we think, okay, I may or may not agree with everything, but I trust them. They're figuring it out. They're on their own. They're going to be able to manage. They're finding their way in the world. And when they get there, and some do it on a different pace, but when they get there, I think this idea of rest and delight is, and I don't know if we're quite there yet, but maybe we can see it from where we are as you turn your kids loose into the world and you think, well, yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful that they will be okay. And not even that, but that they will do good. They will be good for others and do good in the world. And there is, I think, a sense of peace, if we could interchange that with the word rest. There's a sense of peace that goes with that, and certainly a lot of joy. Like I said, I could not have anticipated that when my kids are your kids' age. You're so busy just trying to figure out the discipline part that the future is far off. But I do think there's truth in that, and it's really nice when it happens.
I turn to verse 20 here. Do you see someone who is hasty in speech? There's more hope for a fool than anyone like that. There's a million examples of this, but I just had an encounter with someone with them, and it's amazing the amount of things that they were able to say in our short encounter. And if I had to be honest, I don't know if there was any substance in any of it. And it's a temptation. I don't mean to point fingers out at others. I'm actually an example par excellence of that temptation. There is significant wisdom in the person who recognizes that foolishness that is silent is leagues better than foolishness that is sprayed into the world with absolutely no restraint. And for those of us who desire to be wise, maybe the first step is to just keep our speech limited.
One of the other coaches and I were giving a young man a little bit of a hard time for something he said yesterday, and he started to respond, and then he said, "I'm just going to stop talking now." And I said, "That's a wise decision. that when you've hit the bottom, stop digging and stop speaking." And certainly that's good. So this next one, I had 21. This is part of the difficulty when we read Scripture. A slave pampered from childhood will come to a bad end. We could have lots of conversations about slave. The word here is also servant, but that's not mutually different in the context of the Proverbs. We'd want to be very careful with a verse like this, applying the word slave and the idea of disciplining a slave, et cetera, et cetera. But if we substitute the word child for slave, or even a person, if we could take that social issue out and we could simply see the truth of what I think the proverb means, that one pampered from childhood will come to a bad end. And we've all been there. We all have struggled either to say no to kids or someone, or we've seen someone else who's never been told no, the child who never hears no, who never has to face the consequences of their action, whose parents are always bailing them out. And there is a deep truth in this that the person who's pampered and never faces accountability for their actions, we do our kids no service when we don't occasionally let them sleep in the bed that they've made. Mm-hmm. And again, there'd be lots of ways we'd have to talk about that if we were trying to really study this verse. Be lots of sensitivity we'd have to give it. But the general truth in it, I think, is helpful, because I think we've all seen what happens when someone never hears the word no.
Yeah, and that has a long tail, by the way.
Yeah.
There's the rest of this chapter has some really strong verses, friends. I would look at verse 23 and verse 24. They're both really good. But towards the idea of my last word, I want to turn to verse 25, which I think is a really positive note to leave our conversation today. The fear of others lays a snare, but one who trusts in the Lord is secure. And My read of the room, Clint, is that a lot of us need to be reminded right now in this time, you can trust the Lord. You can put your hope and faith in him. I think it was well said in the sermon a couple weeks ago that we as people of faith, we don't put our trust in any party. We don't put our trust in any particular human. We don't put our trust in promises that get made, founded or unfounded. Friends, we can put our trust and rest comfortably in the lordship of Jesus Christ. And many of us need to return to that promise because in a moment of anxiety and great disruption on so many levels, we tend to, I think, give our allegiance to the loudest voice or to the one who offers the quickest solution. And never can human fallible creatures provide a greater redemption, greater restoration, greater reconciliation than the Creator who names and calls each one by name. So if you live today with any of this fear, friends, put your trust in the Lord. That is a sure and confident place to live your life.
It's a good place to end. We appreciate you all being with us today. We thank you for your time. We will press on tomorrow, chapter 30, finish up on Friday with chapter 31. At this point, we are still talking about what to do next, so if you have suggestions for us, let us know. Otherwise, maybe tomorrow or Friday we'll talk to you about what we're thinking, but we'd sure like to hear from you first.
Friends, good to have you with us. See you tomorrow. Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. It's a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.